Welcome to the Beyond Atheism podcast, with me, Nathan Alexander, and my co-host, Todd Tavares. Moving beyond questions of God's existence, this podcast asks, what's next in a world without God? If you're enjoying the show so far, make sure to like and subscribe, rate and review, and consider supporting us on Patreon.
As we've mentioned many times in the podcast, the number of non-religious people is growing alongside religious diversity within our society. Secularism aims to balance the rights of these different religious groups or non-religious groups to practice the faith, along with the rights of non-religious and other religions to be free from particular religious influence. Or does it? There are many different models of secular states in practice, and there's no clear answer which is the best or most effective at removing the influence of religion from government. To talk more about secularism in principle and practice, we are joined by Dr. Jacques Berlinerblau, professor of Jewish civilization in the Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University, and the author of a new book, Secularism, The Basics. Jacques, welcome to Beyond Atheism.
Hi, Todd. Hi, Nathan. Thanks for having me.
Hello. Thanks again, Jacques, for agreeing to come on and talk with us. Looking forward to it. Just to get started, maybe you can just tell us how you got into studying secularism.
Yeah, thanks. Like so many people, I feel that after 9/11 was just an enormous cultural kick in the butt, right? So many researchers, scholars in particular, started shifting their research agendas as a result. I had the added push of living across the street from the World Trade Center. Not that I needed that, but I just saw everything in such vivid horror, everything that was going on that day. And I didn't have really tools to explain it. So maybe that was it. What I wanted to do was I wanted to use whatever training I had to try to make sense of what I just saw.
Once you started this project, it takes on a pretty massive scope, going back to the divide. It begins, I think, 2,000 years ago, through the Reformation and Enlightenment. What was unexpected in your findings? Or did you have expectations going into it?
Well, when I started out, I didn't know what the hell I was doing. And it's because we don't really have resources on secularism. So if I look back to a work like the 2005 The Secular Bible, which was really well reviewed, well, the joke's on you, reviewers who liked me. There are a lot of problems with that book because I wasn't thinking coherently about secularism. So it's been a tremendous learning journey. I love the fact that you mentioned the Reformation and medieval antiquity. I didn't know that stuff 15 years ago. I had to figure that out really on my own with a little help from kind of isolated pockets of scholarship here and there. So I'm just worried that in 10 years, everything I write in this book will be completely obsolete, but I guess that's a good thing.
Yeah. So I guess we can ask what is secularism?
Oh, man. Yeah. So I think my definition has changed 3 times, 2005, 2012, and the present one in 2022. I really do like the definition that I've come up with now, right? So I'm just going to read it because it's sort of impregnable. You want to create, like Max Weber, for example, right? You want to create a definition of power, right? Or legitimate authority or charisma that people can just tattoo on their arm, right? That people can cite in a graduate seminar. So here we go. I'm just going to read it. Political secularism refers to legally binding actions of the secular state that seek to regulate the relationship between itself and religious citizens and between religious citizens themselves. Just drop the mic, walk out of the studio. There we go, right? Now we've got to get to non-believers at some point, and we will. But that's the definition I'm very comfortable with right now.
And this is a political model. So we're not talking about a society or a secular culture. We're looking at the laws and how they're in practice in a state. Is that correct?
Exactly, right? And so you take a really great scholar like Phil Zuckerman, and when Phil speaks about secularism, he's usually speaking about non-believers, right? So he talks about secular Americans. He uses it as an adjective. If only other researchers were as scrupulous as Professor Zuckerman. I think around 2012, I realized I had to focus just on political secularism. If not, the conversations would veer into pandemonium really, really fast. Everybody was talking about somebody different. So you're absolutely correct, Todd. This is about political secularism, not secularization, not secular humanism, not Charles Taylor's notion of secularity, and not secularism as atheism, which, as you know, reading the book is a bit of a problem, at least for me.
Hmm. Yeah. So in the book, you give four main models of secularism. Can you just briefly lay out those different models?
Sure, absolutely. I call them
Oh,
frameworks.
frameworks. Okay.
And basically, I argue that every secularism has these 10 principles that we've accumulated across the millennia, and they mix and match them in different ways, some ways that are really benign and positive, and some ways that are absolutely catastrophic to the health of the species. So the four models that I've identified, there are probably more, would be separationism, which I feel is very wobbly. We can get into that. It's an American model. French laïcité. My name is Jacques, after all, right? And I live to protect laïcité from irate Anglophones.
Okay.
Oh, all
We
right.
might get deep Quebec here,
Yeah.
Nathan, if you want.
Yes.
Then there is the model that we see emanating from the Soviet Union, which is really problematic. And a lot of folks who study secularism and are pro secular just don't want to acknowledge that it's there. Unfortunately, it's probably, in terms of body count, it's probably the most popular form of secularism, and we really do need to deal with it. It's like secularism gone wrong. And then there's the Indian model, which is sneakily, shall we say, it's like that quiet model which is influencing so many other models, especially the American model, which I refer to as accommodationism.
On the show, we've discussed, I think we're mostly familiar with the American. We've talked a lot about the Soviet approach. So maybe we should talk about those briefly and then really get into the French, the laïcité. Is that right?
Yeah, right?
And more, and some of the accommodationists. So what's the if we're thinking about these 10 principles that are behind them, the frameworks, what is special about the American model, which claims to be separationist? I think that's
Yeah.
right.
The American model is kind of a shit show. Uh, And the scholar who really made me understand that was Noah Feldman. In a book, it was called Divided by God, I believe. So he was looking at the case law. And I mean, I don't want to speak. I mean, the great thing about secularism is it's a conversation. So I want to be in a conversation with you guys. But very quickly, what Feldman argued is that separation of church and state had a moment with Mr. Jefferson in 1802, his Danbury letter, and nobody actually listened to him, least of all were the courts, right? And then comes the Great Awakening. So absolutely nobody's thinking about separationism. Then there are a couple of Mormon polygamy cases in the 1870s, the Reynolds case of 1878. And then nobody's thinking about separation as a judicial principle until 1947 with the Everson case. And then separationism has a glorious 30 years. Think of John Kennedy saying, I believe in an America where the separation of church and state is right. That's amazing, right? He said that in September 1960. And then in 1985, Justice Rehnquist pulls the curtains down on the show. And he says separation is a bad metaphor, it's bad history, and it should be explicitly abandoned. All right, so separationism, we can speak about it. What I find unusual in the United States is so many secular people, nuns, religious minorities, folks that really do not want to live in a Christian theocracy, a conservative Christian theocracy, are pining for separation of church and state. Yet, as a judicial doctrine, it's dead. The courts aren't working with separation, and separation has some other problems which we might get into. So, my view is secularism in the United States has to reinvigorate, re energize, right? Rethink its fundamental premises. And unfortunately, separationism is not the vessel that's going to move us forward. So that's one model right there. I'm sure you guys might have some questions or some criticisms of that. So I'm going to throw it back to you guys.
Well, we weren't prepared so much to speak about that one because we both kind of live in that system, and we know that the separation isn't really absolute or isn't practical. And one of the things that stands out, which you bring up, is that it's the real challenge with it is that we can't be just sort of living in a public sphere free from religious influence if we ourselves are influenced by religion in private.
Yeah, it's a stark metaphor. It's like the metaphor has taken over the ship, right? It's controlling it. It's too stark. We don't live in a separationist world. Our politicians are religious, right? There are people that are pro-secularism who are very religious and don't want to work on Christmas. Let's say there are a couple of other quirks about separationism. I'd really like to speak about the personnel of secularism, and it does have a very kind of white male genealogy to it, which I would urge American secularism to confront and move away from as fast as possible in terms of the types of people that advocate for secularism. But as we close the window in our discussion of that first framework, let me say one thing. I'm looking at the 14th Amendment to rescue us from the first. And when I said American secularism is kind of a shit show, I really should have said the religion clauses are a disaster.
Mm,
Right. Yeah.
I don't know what Mr. Madison was doing, who I have tremendous respect for. Nobody knows, in fact. If you look at what scholars who study that day or those days in July when he was writing the First Amendment, which he didn't want to write to begin with, we're not entirely sure how he ended up with that version, those 16 words. So we are the prisoners of those 16 words. So sometimes I try to re-angle American secularism, reroute it through the 14th Amendment, equal protection under the law. I believe that's what we want as secular Americans, whether we're religious or not, it doesn't matter. We want equal protection under the law. We don't want to live according to Christian theological dogma. We don't want our reproductive freedoms predicated on a very narrow conception, religious conception of when life begins. So I'm all for the 14th Amendment sort of silencing the First Amendment.
yeah, and
Interesting.
when you're talking about the 16 words, you're talking about the Establishment Clause, which the U.S. the federal government will not establish a religion, and it allows free exercise.
Right. Congress shall make no law, right, respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. It sounds great, right? Etch it on the facade of a church if you want. It's really sloppy draftsmanship, as many jurists pointed out. It doesn't make tremendous sense, and it's not working for American secularists.
Well, to maybe take a positive spin on it, if we can, the how did it work for the 40 years where it was sort of the law, the sort of secular guiding law of the land between 47 and 85?
Yeah, I think that was the great post World War II liberal moment. That was just a moment where, in various offices of government, state, federal, local, you had people that were willing to see the logic in separationism. And there is a logic, right? Once the evangelicals got back in the game and united with their intellectual mentors, that would be conservative Catholics, it was game over. They dismantled the separationist logic within decades rather quickly because, as Rehnquist pointed out, it is sort of a perplexing metaphor. It's a strange thing to ask for. And it's, as I pointed out, it's not necessarily working for secular people in the United States. I just want to emphasize again equality, 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 equal protection under the law. That's where the efforts of the American secular movement should be directed.
I just wanted to maybe transition into talking about the laïcité, the French model. And in Canada, there's actually, we sort of have the case of sort of two models of secularism operating in the same country. In Quebec, there is the laïcité model, but in the rest of Canada, there's more sort of the separationist model. Anyway, in Quebec, there's been a recent law that was passed that prohibited public officials from wearing any kind of religious garb. And recently it came to a head last month, I think, when a public school teacher was fired from her job for wearing a hijab. And so obviously many people in the rest of Canada kind of see this as a racist, discriminatory law, whereas people in Quebec see it as, just secular principles or principles of secularism, of laïcité. How would you defend laïcité, I guess, from the criticism of the Anglosphere?
Yeah, this is very delicate because I know you're in Canada right now. There's a long history of Anglos, and I'm throwing shade at the term,
Okay.
of of exhibiting this sort of Francophobia, or not really wanting to understand France on France's terms. They prefer to understand France on their own Anglo terms. And I think that's a big mistake. There was a piece recently in The Atlantic which ran that script yet again. Like, oh, these French, they're crazy. What's their problem? Why can't they be like us? You know why they can't be like us? You know why they can't be like us, Todd and Nate? You know why? Because of that awful, bloody, torturous history that they've had with the Catholic Church. So I don't agree with these rules about not letting people wear their hijab. So let me first say that, right? That's not my preferred brand of secularism. But I do feel we have to make a much greater effort to understand why the French are the way they are. They are the way they are, well, because of the, Louis XIV and the French Revolution and Napoleon and the Paris Commune and the Dreyfus Affair. They've had a blood-soaked history in terms of church-state relations, and they've learned things, or so they think they've learned things from that, in a way that in the Anglosphere we've never had that. I had a joke in my previous book, How to Be Secular, and the joke was, while the Americans were basically dancing out and belting out show tunes from 1776, right? The French were guillotining one another, right? If you look at what was happening at the end of the 18th century in the United States around religion, compared to what was happening in France. And Mr. Jefferson, as we know, was in Paris at the time. We can understand why the French are so different. So let's go back a second and just try to understand what laïcité is. I like laïcité for one reason. Actually, there are many. It has the courage of its convictions, right? And its conviction is this: religion has to be governed, full stop, right? I mean, you can have religious freedom, and laïcité is not anti-religious freedom, but when push comes to shove, the state is on top. And if it's not on top, and this is a really great insight from John Locke, no one gets to God, at least in the modern world, right? And this, by the way, is what sets off the right and the left about secularism, right? All secular models have this super powerful state, which is telling everyone what to do. So the Foucauldians go mad, right? Because they don't like powerful states. I understand that.
Yes.
But the right, especially the fringe right, which is so terrified about the state coming in and taking away your guns, right? They're equally outraged by the power that secular theory grants to a state to tell religious bodies and souls what to do. So, laïcité, in a nutshell, is a system in which the state is unambiguously on top. With that said, there is religious freedom in France. And I think this is what a lot of these hysterical and sensationalist takedowns of laïcité tend to miss. There's a tremendous degree of religious freedom in France. It's a good place to live as a Jew, as a Muslim, as a Catholic, though they have these oddities, right? They have these things they do that puzzle us as Anglos, but there's a lot that's positive there in terms of what we as secular Americans, the three of us, let's say, really value.
Well, could you tell us a little bit more about that? Because I have a follow-up that's addressing a criticism, but thinking about this as a good thing, what would make it good for religious people? If you're a religious citizen in France, what is good about laïcité?
If you're a religious person that feels you've got to sing your religion loud and proud in the public square, France is really bad for you. All right. So it's a country that permits you to really, like classical secular theory, you can do whatever you want in the confines of your church as long as it's lawful, or your synagogue. Just don't bring it into public because it's volatile. That's the fear, right? It's going to get out of control. And so here's the United States trash talking France on secularism for like 50 years. And then we have January 6th, right? Which to me is a quasi-religious episode of unrest. It's not just political. There's a tremendous kind of Christian fringe right dimension to that, right? So it's almost as if the French are saying, I told you so, when they see something like that, right? I've been doing a lot of research on who was storming the Capitol and what they were saying and the prayers they were offering up. So to get back to your question, Todd, as you know, I'm Jewish. I have Sephardic Jewish family in France. We go to synagogue. It's fine. I mean, I don't see what the problem is, right? very, very quiet about it, and we keep it to ourselves, and we don't talk about it in public. But there are forms of religion, and I concede this is a problem, where you can't keep it to yourself. Right? I remember that cornerback who used to play for the Arizona Cardinals. He used to say, "Whoa, Jesus was balling today, woo!" Because he felt Jesus was doing the cornerbacking, right? So he couldn't stop talking about Jesus, right? And it's kind of sweet, and nobody here gets that upset about it. But the French don't want to hear that because they feel it leads to episodes like January 6th. And maybe they're not entirely wrong, right? I'm not saying they're entirely right, but maybe they're onto something.
So in this model, what works about this model is it keeps it private. Religion is allowed to flourish. It's allowed to do what it wants, to say what they want, to feel what they want, believe what they want, so long as it's in a private sphere.
Keep it private. Also, the state, and this is what's a little weird about the model, quite honestly, right? The state supports religion, right? So the state has, and this is a Napoleonic flourish, right? The state kind of decides who's official and who's not official. Could you imagine that in the United States? So
Right,
I
yeah.
can't say I'm completely comfortable with that, right? But the French did manage to do it for most of the 20th century in a way that most religious groups, even the Catholic Church post World War II, and where was the Catholic Church in World War II? The French Catholic Church, the so-called eldest daughter, was on the side of fascism, right? So in the new constitutions of the late republic, right, even the Catholic Church says, okay, you got us, all right, let's just give it a shot. And I do
Right.
think it works out.
Yes.
And then we have the question of Islam and Islamism, which I cover in the book, which is exceedingly complex, right? And maybe we'll get to that towards the end of our discussion. So yeah, laïcité, the core feature is this unambiguous control of religion, the demand to keep religion private, but also the state assists religion, right? And it becomes a problem for Islam because when the laws were written in 1905, they had a teeny tiny Muslim population. So all of the state assistance now basically goes to Catholic churches, synagogues, Lutheran, and Reformed faith communities, right? So it's as if the Muslims weren't grandfathered in, and that's completely unfair, right? And that's a challenge for French laïcité at present.
Yeah. So, but in terms of criticism, one of the things that, particularly from that Foucaultian postmodern constructivist perspective, what they would say is actually this form of secularism, it's just cover, right? This is a discourse of power, and what they're actually doing is they're using this to prop up the existing religious structure that's there.
That's I call that the false neutrality claim, and that's a claim that is really strong. So
But there is something to it, right? Because
there is, yep,
you're allowed to wear a cross of a certain size,
right.
correct?
I
So,
don't disagree. Go ahead, Todd. I'm sorry.
whereas I don't know if is there an exception for a burqa of a certain size or hijab of a certain size, and we still have people like Macron taking honorific titles from the Pope.
Right, right.
So is this a matter of like, look, this is how you this is a problem of execution, or is there something to this critique where it's serving this old constituency?
I think it is a problem of execution. The theory is right. The practice for secularism has not been good. Every form of secularism is subject to the criticism you've made, which is perfectly accurate. In the United States, our American secularism, even from 1947 to 1985, was very Judeo-Christo, if you know what I mean, right? It really wasn't a secularism that was thinking about Santeria, right? It wasn't thinking about Islam. So the false neutrality problem, I end the book by saying there has been no innovation in political secular theory like ever, like in 2 centuries,
Right.
right? People
Right.
just stop.
Yes.
This is what we need to start thinking about it. Why do we keep making this mistake, right? No matter what secular framework you look at, the accusation is made, just like you said, Todd, that it tacitly favors one religion against another, and it's just a method of subjugating others, right? And I'm a scholar, not an activist. I see the merit in that criticism, and I think secular theorists have to think it through much more seriously than they do because there's so few secular theorists out there.
Mm,
It's not a
yeah.
lucrative job.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I wanted to ask about the Indian
Yeah, definitely.
model. That's one I really didn't know that much about. But I don't know if this is right, but in the book you seem somewhat like that might be a model you kind of prefer. Would that be right? Or
Yeah, as long as we got the nuns in there, I like it a lot. I create a fake secular state in chapter 14 called Secularistan, and it kind of takes the Indian model and goes a little bit further. The Indian model I refer to, I don't know if my usage is totally accepted. There are various ways of referring to it. I call it accommodationism because the fundamental premises are so different from laicite. In laicite, religion is to be observed with a scowl from the demanding heights of the minister's office, right? That's the French attitude towards religion. What are those worshippers up to over there? Hey, Gaston, get down there and see what. The Indian model, and this is why so many people are enthralled by India, right? I mean, it's a civilization that just adores spirituality, right? Not religion per se, but it's a place where religion is just welcome in a very de Tocquevillian sense. Religion is seen as a good. It's good for people to be religious, right? Yeah, just add another. What I love about Hinduism is, yeah, bring more beliefs, right, into the. It's all good. It's all the divine, right? So there's something very special and energetic about India, right? And I feel like John Coltrane or the Beatles right now, right? This typical Westerner that goes to India.
yeah.
Yeah, I do feel like John Coltrane and the Beatles. But so in India with Gandhi in particular, he speaks of, I don't want to say it in Hindi because I'd mispronounce it, equal respect for all religions. And remember how I mentioned the 14th Amendment earlier, guys? I like that word equal, right? The state's job is to respect each religion equally. If we could just add and non-believers as well, right? I think we'd be in a very good place in terms of building a new secularism for the 21st century. And that's what secular Stan was supposed to be. So, sure, that's the accommodationist model. It crept into the United States. So if you look at George Bush's much maligned Office of Faith-Based Initiatives, right? That's the Indian model, right? The state argues, and I know that Todd, you're a political scientist, right? The state argues that religion is a good thing, right? So it supports religious groups in some material way, all right? But as we know, the Bush model ended up becoming kind of a trough for various Christian right groups, right, to enrich themselves, right? Then Barack Obama tried it, right, and that didn't work out too good either. So we're still trying to get rid of the kinks in this model. I don't know what the Biden version is going to look like. I don't have great expectations for that. Nevertheless, notice how Indian accommodationism seeped into the United States once separationism was obliterated by Justice Rehnquist and the Christian right, though they weren't necessarily working in cahoots.
But one of the boogeymen in the U.S. is Sharia law, which we hear also about. I mean, in right wing media sources, there's this conspiratorial specter of, the no go zones in Europe and Sharia law in Michigan. But they have a sort of two-tier system in accommodationist models that would allow Sharia to basically effectively be the law, correct?
Yeah, and it's created tremendous problems in India because Hindu nationalists argue, and I'm definitely not a Hindu nationalist. The argument, though, I see what the problem is, right? Their argument is that Muslims are the beneficiaries of a largesse from the state, which most Hindus do not receive, or most non Muslim citizens, right? They fail to mention the discrimination that Muslim citizens in India have faced on a quotidian basis since independence, right? So that's there as well. But as a secularist, again, I do not see eye to eye with the BJP. I've written some articles about the BJP and Modi and what they're doing, and quite frankly, I don't like it, right? But the argument itself that by permitting Sharia law to be practiced, there, shall we say, distortions or deformations of equality for Indian citizens really strikes me as plausible. Now, what happened in India was the Congress Party traditionally would reach out to the large Muslim minority and grant them more and more and more rights, right? Of course, the counterbalance is the discrimination and the second class citizenship, which Muslims lived by. So I don't want to come down on any side. I think that is something that Indian secularism and its theorists are going to have to work out as well. I did a study with Pascal Fournier on how women fare in these systems where there's a secular law and like Sharia law. And two things happen. Either they get doubly discriminated against, or they find very good lawyers and they use one law code. We looked at this in Canada, Nathan. They use one law code against the other law code and get their divorces, for example. So that's an area for us to look into. How do women, how do LGBTQ folks fare when they have two law codes that they can live by? All right. And often the results are quite good, strangely enough, but
Mhm.
I'm still thinking about it.
Yeah. Yeah, one thing I just as you're saying that, I mean, is that there's some kind of conflict, I suppose, between kind of like individual rights versus group rights, like the rights of a religious group. And I mean, I think like, I mean, I don't know that much about Sharia law, but I would think, that individual rights might suffer in some way in that as you grant a particular right to a religious group, like certain individuals, women or um, sexual minorities might suffer because of that. So I think that there might be some kind of conflict there.
Oh, absolutely. I don't want to do that. I don't want to route my answer to you through Islam. I want to route it through Orthodox Judaism.
Okay.
We've heard the stories of gay folks who grew up in Orthodoxy being sent to vicious aversion therapy, right? We know these stories, right? We know that there are problems with the mistreatment of women. We know that sexual assault goes underreported. So, absolutely, when the state is not in charge of enforcing the law and monitoring the law, these types of things are going to happen to the most vulnerable, and the most vulnerable are often women. They're often LGBTQ persons. So, yeah, I'm with you on that, Nathan. Right? So, as I always say, secularism is super complicated. We're realizing it again, the three of us, as we speak. There's no easy answer here. And it amazes me how cocksure people are pro and
Yeah.
against
Yeah.
secularism, right? I mean, they come in really hot, right? And what I try to do in my scholarship and in my classes in my book is say, well, step back, all right, slow your roll. We've got to think this through because it's a hugely important issue, and there's a lot left for us to figure out.
Yeah. So it sounds like the accommodation principle kind of does away with this principle of state superiority.
Well, the state is the guarantor of the equality, right? The state's job is to be fair to every single religious group, right? And make sure that the religious groups between themselves do not in any way harm one another or obstruct one another's rights. But here's a problem with accommodationism. I do this a lot with my students at Georgetown. How do you divide the pot? Let's say there's $1 billion that the government has, right? Do you do it on the basis of size? Do you do it on the basis of need? Right? How does the government come up with a formula to divide monies? Because we're really speaking about money after all, right? Second problem is, what do you do with religious groups that are simply off the reservation? That's an American problem, right? What do you do with the Aryan nations, right? Do you write them a big fat old check to run a soup kitchen, all right? What do you do with a group that runs a soup kitchen, right? Let's say Westboro Baptist, right? And when you walk in, they start insulting you, right? Or there are groups of black Israelites on the street corners of Washington and New York that just kind of, it's like open air comedy, right? They're just insulting people as they walk by and they're adhering to their religious precepts. So a theoretical question for accommodationism is, how do you engage with groups that have very little of what we might call a sense of civic belongingness? Habermas used a funny line, which I always like. He talked about groups that barricade themselves from the rest of society. The Amish come to mind,
Yeah.
ultra-Orthodox Jews, right?
Mm.
What do you do with them, right?
Yeah.
You
Yes.
give them money, and what do you expect, right? I mean, what does the state expect from them? As I said, really complicated problem, and that's what secularism is here to try and figure out if we had the will to do so.
Well, the Soviets had an answer for that, and yeah, and I think this has
Funny.
been
God, that
this.
was really funny. That was really good. I'm working on comedy now. I'm working on a book on that was funny, man. That shit was funny. Go on.
and
It's fun.
the
That was good. That was really
and this has been picked up by China.
yeah.
So how do they resolve that problem?
Yeah, they talk the talk of secularism, freedom of conscience, right, equality, and they essentially, I want to say this like the guilty kid in class, right? And they essentially completely abused their religious populations and murdered people, and created a totalitarian hell for everyone, right? So this is, I believe I once referred to it as secularism's drinking problem. You saw this in Syria, by the way, where you had a secular regime, right? It gets so drunk with order, which is one of those 10 principles. It so emphasizes order that it becomes a hellish, inhumane dystopia. And this is why I warned earlier you can't come in hot on secularism as a supporter all the time because if you read what the Bolsheviks are writing, and I really sort of, what's the word? I agonize over this in the book. I ultimately conclude, yeah, it's secular. My question is, and we have Nathan here maybe to help us out. Where did they get it from? I'm not entirely sure. I don't think we have the scholarship, Nathan, to figure out how Lenin got his understanding of did he get it from the Victorian infidels, which is my suspicion, via Marx, who was living in London at the time, right? Did he get it from the French? We know that they loved the French, but thought they weren't extreme enough. So that's a question for scholars, right? How did the Bolsheviks get their secularism? We know what they did with it, Todd, right? They kind of ruined everything, right, for everyone. And then it spread in Soviet successor states, and now it's in China.
I think the story we've heard on this program is that it's pretty domestic because it's a problem with their version of the ancient regime, in that the Orthodox Church held so much power and controlled so many resources that they were an enemy of the state,
Yeah,
and
it's true.
that and
They
then
were
we get that weird bifurcation between them being the one of the worst enemies, and then later after 41 being one of the best friends, this
yeah,
thing that
Stalin makes
that
that
has to be
shift.
colonized by the state.
And I want to hear what Nathan's view on this because I know he's written about this. But just quickly on what you just said, Todd. Yeah, the ancien regime problem, right? I'm not going to
Mm.
rock a Romanov T-shirt, right? I mean, they were awful. They were absolutely awful. There's
Yeah.
some scholarship is suggesting they were more progressive than they're made out to be, right? But yeah, look what they had to do to the ancien regime. But we know human nature, right? The backlash was just too extreme. But Nathan, can I just get your opinion on that thing I said? How did the Russians? Did it come through England? I know you work on these periods. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah. I sort of wonder if it's from the French Revolution, like the sort of anti-religious actions during sort of the radical phase of the French Revolution that might have inspired Lenin and that group. I mean, because I don't think the British secularists in the 19th century were really supportive of like removing religion by force, like removing people's religion by force. So I think it could be like from the French experience in the French Revolution. Although I'm not sure. That's just sort of a hunch or a guess or something. Yeah.
Yeah, and just to go back to one of my overarching themes, I mean, we're both kind of experts on this, right?
Mhm.
And we don't know.
Yeah.
And
Right.
the reason we don't know is because the history of secularism really isn't known. I think the history of atheism is actually far better chronicled than the history of secularism.
Hmm.
I'll just leave it at that for now.
Hmm. Yeah. Just to pick up on the Victorian angle again, you mentioned in your book, you talk about this debate between Charles Bradlaugh and George Holyoake, kind of about Holyoake saying secularism doesn't necessarily equate to atheism, and you can have secularism without atheism. But Charles Bradlaugh, on the other hand, was more of a hardliner and said that actually you did at the end you needed to have atheism because or that secularism and atheism were kind of intertwined because the religious would always seek to impose themselves on society. And I have to say I'm somewhat I definitely see what Bradlaugh is getting at. I'm somewhat sympathetic to his position. Yeah, what do you think about that? That like I guess I mean to put it into a question is to ask like would secularism be helped by there being more atheists? I suppose.
Yeah, boy, what a question. Let me tell you what a problem is. Secular theory wasn't built. It's built in the 17th century via Locke, right? He gives us the clear statement, though there are probably a dozen other people that we don't know about enough, like von Puffendorf is an example, right? The first Earl of Shaftesbury, for some reason, whenever I say that, my students start cracking up, right? There are all these figures in the 18th century who are William Penn, right? There are all these figures. Oh, here's one. John Milton, right? I'm working on a paper now with a Miltonist, right? So there are people that are thinking this way in the 17th and 18th century. To get to your question, Nate, they're not any non-believers then, right? Everyone is calling everyone else an atheist, but that's just a pejorative, right? That's just the worst thing you can say, a Calvinist can say about a Catholic is, you damn bloody atheist, right? But in terms of non-believers, we have a hard time finding one who conforms to our definition until, I don't know, like 1730, 1740. The scholarship changes on this. So secular theory is not built to accommodate atheists, right? And I see that as kind of part of my job. One, to point that out so we can start the conversation, and then to motivate people to say, okay, how do we bring non-believers into this? Here's something I was writing about today. Do non-believers have free exercise rights? If the First Amendment grants free exercise, right? And you have no religion, you're a non-believer with no religion. I'm a non-believer with a religion, right? But let's say you're a non-believer with no religion. Do you have a free exercise right? And if not, why not? Right? Why can't you have one? Or what aren't you getting in terms of equality that another citizen doesn't have? So my answer to your question is we really have to theorize, right? We need people that are going to think about the legitimate role and rights and place of non-believers in this polity, but the theory wasn't built for that. So we're improvising. It's like jazz, right? We're just we're working through these chord changes, right, with like a brand new instrument or something. Or I don't know what the image is, but I really would like to think much more about this.
Mm. So maybe with that in mind, maybe you could take us to secular stand, because in I think all of these cases we've been discussing, there's still a religious majority. Whereas the world we're kind of planning for, why we're thinking about this is there's a coming majority that'll at least be irreligious. They may have beliefs, they may be deist or theist, but it looks like they're not going to be attending church regularly. They don't proclaim to have any set faith. How is secularism going to be redefined, or how do we need to reimagine it in a world where there is a secular majority?
A secular majority, as in
As in
religiously on.
irreligious.
So are we, just to be more precise, Todd, are we speaking atheists and agnostics, or those who are simply not religiously affiliated? So tell me what this world would look like. So who's that?
Ideally, I would like to say it's atheist and agnostic, but we know that the nuns are far more complicated than that.
Right.
So if we could just perhaps start with what it would be under the nuns.
Hmm. Yeah,
And
I
conceptualize it.
wonder. See, didn't who are those guys? What's the name of that show? The cartoon. South Park. South Park. They did a sort of send up on this, as I told you, in their
Right.
interesting
Yes.
comedy. Like what would happen in a world like a Dawkins type world, and there were arguments amongst the atheists, right? So I would never underestimate the human capacity for folly, for internecine strife, right? So I don't think in a I don't think a world populated by non-believers would have more or fewer problems, right? And I wouldn't want to, as a non-believer myself, I wouldn't want to live in a world with only non-believers, right? I like the push and the pull, right? And this is where secularism comes in. Secularism is that thing that makes sure the non-believers' rights are as respected as those of the Catholic, right, or the Freemason, or whatever that might be. I'm wondering, this is my fear, I'm wondering if in a society of non-believers, Todd, and this is my literary side coming in, right, would the same gradations, the same enmities, the same human folly enter the equation as did in the 17th century during the wars of religion? And I'm actually going to ask both of you guys that question. I mean, if we did achieve our utopia, the John Lennon song, right? It all comes
Yeah.
true, right? The John Lennon
Yeah.
song.
Yeah.
All right, is that going to be this incredible world, Todd? It's just going to be amazing? Is there just going to be jazz on every street corner and comedy clubs everywhere we go? And what's it going to be like, Todd?
Well, I would hope for magnanimity. That's
Right.
if I'm saying that right. I would hope that we don't do to them what they do to us.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah.
Like that, imposing beliefs, dogmatic structures on them, denigrating them based on their worldview. And it's the question of how the power structure is going to be arranged, that where you have a different majority now. How are those minority rights, which have been trampled in the past, how are they going to be ensured in the coming times?
Right, through a secularism predicated on a non-believing majority, right? So somebody should imagine that, right? What would secularism look like where the overwhelming majority of your citizens are non-believers, but you have some believers sprinkled in there as well? And that's a great thought experiment. Nathan, can I
Yeah.
ask you this question?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is similar to Todd. I mean, again, I would definitely not want to go down like the sort of Soviet model or anything like that. I mean, it is an interesting question. I mean, I guess like another thing is, like you were mentioning earlier about those kind of religious groups like the Amish or whoever who are kind of who wall themselves off from the rest of society. And one would wonder if something like that would happen with if there were a large majority of atheists, agnostics, and other non-believers. Like, would these religious groups sort of become increasingly isolated, and then what would you do with that? But I do think, I mean, obviously, it's like if we could sort of snap our fingers and everyone was a non-believer, I mean, there would still be plenty of other issues, other political issues to solve as well. Yeah.
People always believe weird shit.
Hmm.
Yeah,
Hmm. Hmm.
but that's why we're so awesome, right? I mean, I think that's why like non-belief the fact that non-believers can recognize that, right? I think is sort of special about non-belief, right? Let's call it self-critical. My first definition of secularism, a bad one, in 2005 was it was simply about self-critique. I've abandoned that, right? But there was something there, right? The secular project, kind of like the Enlightenment project, right, is this radical assault on the self, and we just did it, right? We were
Yeah.
just being very, very
Right.
secular and say, "Oh,
Yes.
it might be worse, right?
Yeah.
If this were atheist utopia."
Mm. Hmm.
Kudos to us.
Yes. Yeah. Right.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Well, Nate, let's. I think at the end, we should maybe go to the starting point of your whole book, which is that to show that the sort of prelude to political secularism in the West comes from religious thinkers, which I found kind of surprising. But when we think about at least the U.S. since 1985, as you were talking about, and what the evangelical movement has done in the U.S., we see that as them, religious groups taking greater political power, merging the holy and the secular against like the world of God and the world of man, taking both scepters. Are there reasons why religious people or organizations, religious institutions should support greater political secularism today?
Yeah, there are, and they do, right? So they're Reform Jews, for example. They're secular humanistic Jews, progressive Muslims, United Churches of Christ, which is a mega denomination, right? The mainline Protestant denominations. This goes back to where my relationship with atheism got really strained. It happened during the period of New Atheism, where I said, no, no, this is a bad idea because we're turning off allies, right? And I lost that argument in the short run. and I was trolled into oblivion for it, right? But I think in the long run, I still want to make that argument, and I'd like to believe I was correct, that the failure of imagination amongst secularists in the United States was how to build a coalition, which is, in my opinion, the majority of the United States, right? People do not want to live in an evangelical theocracy.
Right.
Well, even conservative Catholics, if they thought about it, right,
Mhm.
wouldn't want to live in an evangelical theocracy. They certainly didn't 500 years ago. I mean,
Right.
the
Yeah.
St. Bartholomew's Massacre must have taught us something, right? So, or the Edict of Nantes, or those types of moments in history. So there's been a failure of thought, a failure of energy, and a failure of imagination. And I do believe most religious Americans are on board with the types of things we've been discussing in terms of political secularism because they don't want to live under somebody else's conception of God. And where is the leadership to bring that about? So, with the new atheist, what I was saying from the beginning, and I've really enjoyed some of your podcasts on Hitchens, for example, I really like that one, right? Is I was saying, this is a bad idea. Like, discuss these things over drinks at a bar, right? Say this in front, lecture about this, right? But don't publish it for the love of God, right? Don't insult religious people like this because you're turning off, you're creating enmity with people who fundamentally agree with you. And the atheist population was simply too small at the time. That was a recurring complaint I made. If you go back to Madeline Murray or Hare, right? She does the classic atheist move is to exaggerate the numbers in the West, right? I guess you definitely could do this in China, right? But there's a history of atheists claiming that they've got like 50 million, right, warriors right behind them, kitted up and ready to go. It's just not true. Think of Daniel Dennett's The Bright Manifesto, right? We got 30 million people. Here we come. Look out. We're going to open up a can of whoop ass. And then comes the 2004 election, right? And the values voters plunge us into perdition, right? So
Yeah.
the
Because they get
naysayers,
so motivated by these atheist boogeymen.
they're motivated, and atheist leadership, I would put that in quotes, leadership, and there might not be that many atheists right now, right? And that's not a problem with atheism, right? I'm an atheist. It's kind of a hard, complicated position to come to, and there are a lot of barriers to letting you be the atheist that we all know you are. Right? So there's a lot, and then you get there, and there are all these different versions. So I think atheism needs a census. Like they need a really accurate census of who's an atheist and who's just not religiously affiliated. I do like that about the nuns research. I think the nuns research is interesting and important, especially when the researchers themselves are not part of these huge polling firms that have their own weird agenda. Because it's showing us there's like a diversity, there's a spectrum of Americans, right, that are not comfortable with organized religion. And some of them don't believe in God at all, right? And some of them are deeply spiritual. I'm very interested in Asian Americans because I've been reading about them, that they always fall into the nuns category. But there's deep spirituality there, but it's not Western spirituality. They express it through honoring their parents, right? Through honoring through small rituals. So there's no theism, but there's spirituality. And yeah, they're on the spectrum. They're part of this great family, right? And this family can't just be white guys, I would add, all right? And Nathan is the man on this, right? So there's this family of nuns, of the religiously unaffiliated, and somebody's got to organize them. Who's going to organize them, Todd? You're the political science
It's like organizing cats.
yeah, agreed.
Well, that's part of what we do here is we're thinking ahead, right? And we want to know at least even what we should be thinking about. And to that end, I think this has been incredibly insightful. But we do have a few more questions for you. This is sort of the lightning round. Nathan, can you explain how Can a True Atheist works?
Yeah. Usually we have a lightning round called Can a True Atheist, and we ask questions about, tongue-in-cheek for the most part, what certain things can a true atheist do. But actually, we're going to change it slightly for you, Jacques, and to change it to can a true secular government do such and such?
All right.
So just sort of short answers. I mean, you can explain your reasoning a little bit, but just mostly short. So Can a true secular government allow polygamy?
Yes. The Reynolds case, 1878. Yes.
Now, does that need to be attached to religious belief, or would it just be for anyone?
Well, I mean, wait,
Under the 14th Amendment, how would that work?
I just feel I'm about to become a headline. All right, hold on one second. What's the opposite of polygamy where women are allowed to marry as many men as they want? Just find that word real fucking fast. Please, please. That too. All right, I qualify my answer. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
That too.
Okay.
Okay. Can a true secular government fund the restoration of old churches?
Only if they did it in an accommodationist way and they did synagogues and ashrams and mosques. Sure. Probably wouldn't work out, but yeah, if they were equal about it and fair. Oh, and flying spaghetti monster shrines as well.
Right. Okay.
They need the money.
They do.
They drink a lot of beer.
Can a true secular government prohibit abortion?
No, because that's such a parochial definition of when life begins, right? That's not the Jewish definition of when life begins, right? Jewish parents would like to abort their children when they're born, right? So, I mean, every religion has a different conception, and science has its own conception, right? So, absolutely not. That is a parochial interpretation of when life, which we are all entitled to, commences, and a secular state could not endorse that.
Can a secular government say, "May God bless our country"?
It can, and I wish it wouldn't. All honor to Michael Newdow. Newdow, was that his name? Right, the guy who tried to take that off the currency and take it out of the Pledge of Allegiance. Theoretically, a secular government should not do that. I really wish it wouldn't, though I wouldn't. I'd cool my jets on that one. I think we've got bigger fish to fry, but I understand the symbolic import of that, and it is unfortunate.
Can a true secular government ban Scientology?
Laicite can, right? Because it says unambiguously, we run the show. And this is our country. So the French can. I don't think our wobbly American version, call it separationism, I don't think we can do that in the United States. And personally, I wouldn't want to do that. I don't want to ban anybody's religion. I really don't, because that just leads to a whole mountain of trouble.
Okay, how about this one? Can a true secular government tolerate religious intolerance?
Yeah, the great question. No. And Locke was very clear about that, right? He was really, really good. In the book, I say the only interesting question about toleration, because it's kind of boring. The only interesting question is, what can't you tolerate? Like, what shit will you not tolerate? So that's it. All right, we're coming in, with a bunch of Navy SEALs, and we're taking you guys out. And I wish we'd address that question, right? You, sir or ma'am, have crossed the line. And here comes the secular state, right? So no, there are certain forms of intolerance. I guess symbolic intolerance. Yeah, I guess we can tolerate it in the United States, but depriving people of their rights? No, 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 no. These like Baker cases and doctor cases and Kim Davis, this clerk, we can't tolerate that. Absolutely not.
Talk about coming in hot.
Yeah.
We've sort of talked about this one already a little bit, but can a true secular government prohibit wearing religious garb in public?
France can, because it's France. Right? And they had the Commune, and they had to deal with, Louis XIV, and they had Napoleon. So a laicite framework can do it, a Soviet framework can do it, an accommodationist framework, absolutely not. And a separationist framework, no. The government shouldn't even be getting involved in whatever religious gear people are wearing. That's not the business of a separationist government. So my personal view is no. Let people wear what they want.
Can a secular government ban religious tattoos?
Same as previous. No, is there an example of that? By the way, I'm just curious.
I'm more curious about how do you address, like, a necklace is one thing.
Right.
How do you address that with a facial tattoo?
Oh, I see. Who sports religiously? Is that like a prison gang thing? No, no, I'm being not being facetious. Do we know who does that? I'm trying to think. Who wears tattoos?
Um, it's pretty mainstream. I'm not sure. Oh, you mean like like does one particular religious
Yeah,
group or sect
yeah.
use tattoos?
I mean, in Polynesia, I would imagine, right? I mean, out in the Pacific, I would imagine there are groups. Native Americans must do it. I know of groups in Africa that do it. So sure, no, the secular state should never, never, under any circumstances, prohibit people from doing that. But what if the tattoo? Let's make it more complicated. I'll ask you guys: would a secular state prohibit a tattoo that says "Enough with Jews"? Right? All right, now that's a problem. All right, now we've got a
Yeah.
problem.
Yeah. Yes.
Well, I'm just how does laissez have something to deal with this? Where okay, you can't have a cross of this size. You can't wear a cross of this size. Can you have a cross of that size exposed on your arm?
Yeah, ostentatious religious symbols, they called it. I'm not familiar with the case law. Can I just add one thing, which is very not in the spirit of what we're discussing, right? Secularism is sort of boring because it's really about case law. And you can't talk about it unless you know some case law. So I don't really know the French case law that well. I know the American case law, adequately for a non-lawyer. So it's about the case law. And I think I just totally harshed our mellow. Sorry, guys. Next question.
No,
Sorry about
that was a professional dodge. I think we
Mm.
gotta respect the game on that one.
yeah.
Whenever there's something you don't want to answer, refer to case law.
Yeah.
Case law. It's too complicated. You wouldn't understand it. No, I don't know. I mean, the French, they did that burkini thing, which was just insane,
Yeah.
right? Where you had mayors on the beaches of Cannes, forcing women not to wear their burkini. Like, the French are weird that way. People don't realize how weird the French are. I mean, like, I know it because I'm half of it, right? They're really strange. Everyone's like, oh, it's all croissant and couture, right? No, these people are nuts. They're crazy. They're crazy people. Street fighting people. I've seen more street fights in France than I did in Brooklyn, New York. I mean, in one summer in Paris, France, you see so much street fighting. All right, I'm going to stop. Next question.
Wow,
Yeah.
that worked out really well. That was a great answer.
Yeah, next question. Can a true secular government teach children about religion?
Yeah, but it never works. You had these groups in the United States that I was involved in pitched battles with about a decade ago. They were trying to do this, and as I did a little investigative journalism, and I was following the funding stream. I didn't like the funding stream at all, right? So it was a Trojan horse to get religion into the public schools, right? Though it was a nice front. It was well done. I don't know where it all ended up. I think it's not a bad idea per se. It's the execution of the idea is nearly impossible. And now let's bring in us. Let's bring in the nuns, right? What are they supposed to do? Those nun kids, right? They're just supposed to sit there and take this all in. Who's teaching their history, right? Where's the Bertrand Russell section, right? Where's the Bradlaugh chapter or unit? I'd love to try it, and I'd like to have a really good group of people doing it, a very diverse group. And I think that would be cool, but I just don't think America is ready for that. What is America ready for right now? I just don't think the nation is ready for that right now, but I wish it could happen, but we're not ready for it.
And finally, can a true secular government support the death penalty?
Yeah, that's really good. Personally, that is such an interesting question. I do believe some people do things that are so egregious. That's one part of my mind, like left brain, right? But then the right brain, mercy and justice says, come on, relax, it's too cruel. So can a secular government, I'd want to know, where does the death penalty come from? Does it have a religious antecedent? I want to hear scientists on this, right? I'm not trying to dodge. I'm actually really fascinated by the question. Like, what? This is like Weber's conversation about the polytheism of values. Like, what can a scientist say about the death penalty other than, well, this is how you would die, right? And this is how your organs would stop functioning if murdered this way. But I'd love to have a conversation about that. I don't know. So just to be safe and humane, I'm going to say no. We should eliminate the death penalty. That's not what I believe, right? I think it's a
Yeah.
really interesting question. I want to think about it more carefully.
Yeah. Which I think is exactly what we learned today, is that like this is, you got to think about it. What we mean by secularism, what we want, and what we're willing to tolerate with,
And
to put up
you
with.
said something, I think it was Todd, that said we have to know what it is we want to know, right? And I just want to, we don't know what to think about yet. And that's why secularism has such a problem. We're bibliographically underserved. That's one problem, right? There's not much data out there. So I do hope my book, which I really like, becomes obsolete in 10, 20 years. That'd be great, right?
Right.
The book
Yes.
self self negates itself because so many people start saying, wait a second, I think this guy's wrong, right? That would make me very, very happy. The other thing I want to warn about, and I think Nathan is well aware of this, is there are just too many people out there claiming to be experts in secularism. I have another life as a literature scholar, and I study Philip Roth. And you don't want to get into it with a person who calls himself a Roth scholar. Like, you better bring your big guns, all right? Because these are people that know their shit, right? So I've never met like a Roth scholar, a self-proclaimed Roth scholar, who didn't have serious, serious standing in the field to discuss it. I think it's the opposite with secularism. I hate to say, so many people freelance in this field. I hate to I hate to end on such a sour note, right? But such an
Well,
uneconomic.
it's great because you've produced an excellent point for it with this book. When will it be available? Is it available now? How do
It's
people get it?
available as we speak.
Oh,
The guys at Amazon are just waiting, right? They're waiting for your call at Amazon.
yes.
Call them up,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
they'll send it over.
Mhm.
They'll walk it over if you want. Yeah, the book is ready to go, and I'm very excited about it because it was a lot of fun to write, and just the fact that we couldn't have had this discussion, guys, 15 years ago when I wrote Secular Bible. Just so you know, there was no one to talk to like
Right.
Todd and Nate. Right? There was no one out there like
Yeah.
you guys. Right? So
Yeah.
thank you for that.
Yeah, no, no, yeah. So people should check out the book. It's really a great introduction. Very like succinct and like easy to read, which is good. And yeah, it's been great chatting with you, Jacques. Thanks.
Yeah,
That was so
great
much fun.
conversation.
Thanks, guys. I appreciate it.
Okay, that was Jacques Berlinerblau. It was a lot of fun chatting with him about secularism.
He is a lot of fun and bright,
Yes.
and I
Yeah.
mean sharp, knows his stuff. And the book has even more, which is
Hmm.
astounding. It's a
Yeah.
great read. Yeah. Oh man, where to begin with this? Okay, so here's the thing that I noticed. He like throughout the discussion, we made it kind of messy, right? Talking about, well, what are the models? What are the principles? Nothing seems to actually fit every principle. No model is perfect. Everyone has drawbacks. They're all sort of historically dependent, right? France has a reason why they have laissez. The Soviets had a reason why they became militant. They had a reason why they became less militant, atheists. It sounds very, very messy, but really, his model of political secularism really sharpens the focus and how we need to think about political secularism, because it's not a culture war, right? He's not talking about should we say Merry Christmas or Happy Holidays. He's talking about what is the state's relationship with religious organizations? What are the laws? Who gets how much of what and how? That's what they're talking about, which is great because like already we don't I don't know any, I've not heard any right-wing Christian critique of the Fed in the United States and said like, they really need to lower interest rates because it's not biblical, right? We don't have this.
Right. Yes. Yes.
There's not in
Yeah.
a like that. There's no really religious economy. I don't know of a church credit card that has lower interest rates and a 7-year jubilee where all debts are forgiven to accord with the Bible. Like we don't have that system. So the economic aspects, we're not talking about that. We're not talking about our society and how we interact. We're just talking about these laws, and it gets pretty, that makes it pretty straightforward, right? What are these 4 points? Can the state sort of ignore religion in the separatist model? Can it accommodate religion in the accommodation model? Can it regulate it in the laissez-faire? Or can it seek to abolish it or dominate it in that Soviet model? And we get to choose. Well, and the important thing is in a system, we're not going to be choosing alone, right? It's going to be democratic. When we have a non-religious majority, how we're going to do it to be fair and equitable is something we should be thinking about now.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's something we talked a little bit about it in the episode, like what happens to secularism when secular people are in the majority. And it is like a case where, yeah, I think you said, like, we don't want to do to them what they did to other other non-believers or whatever. And I think for me, the key is like ensuring freedom of belief, freedom to practice. I mean, I think one thing he talks about in the book, which we didn't really get into, is like this distinction between like beliefs and actions. So like you can believe what you want, but like when it comes to actions, there might be cases where your actions might infringe on, like when you're practicing your faith, it might infringe on someone else's rights in that case. And that's where it gets a little messy. Obviously in the French model, there's much more like there's no accommodation for like if you're practicing, if that infringes on someone's rights, it's obvious that their rights take precedence. But other models might have a slightly different approach.
Right. And yeah, and I mean, like you said, no one is perfect and none of them are absolute. So you still have systems now like where the law is not supreme, right? Where you make allowances for how things are done based on someone's religion. So I think in the US, there were even the COVID protocols were ruled to be like, you can't do that because you can't force these churches to shut down because you can't regulate how they behave, right?
Yeah,
You,
that's a really good example. I mean, or even vaccine mandates or something like that. I mean, like there definitely is a balance. Like if someone has a belief that for whatever reason their religion prevents them from getting a vaccine, does sort of the interest of the public safety trump that, or does the individual right trump over it? And I mean, I think different models sort of have different answers to that.
yeah, if a church wants to open and have unmasked members, how does that match with free exercise versus public health? Definitely. And that, I mean, these are issues that we've seen. And how strong do we want state supremacy there? But I mean, the thing with laissez-faire is it really is an impingement on sort of any public expression. But I'm kind of there is something sympathetic to it. So what really turns you off about it?
Well, I think one thing for me, like we talked a little bit in the episode about the this case in Quebec of and it's the same sort of thing in France of like public officials not being able to having to remove their religious garb in order to hold their positions. I mean, it's just interesting, just because there are certain things like where wearing particular religious clothing is more related to particular religions. Like I don't think there's necessarily this similar sort of thing across all religions equally. I mean, in terms of like giving importance to clothing, whatever, or like a turban or something like that for Sikhs. I mean, yeah, I think the thing is like when it's like enthusiastically enforced, one wonders if it's purely about maintaining sort of state neutrality in religion, or keeping religion out of the public square, or whether it's sort of like tainted with kind of xenophobia and racism. I mean, yeah, that's what I kind of wonder. And also, I mean, like you hear sort of arguments. Like I read some arguments about the Quebec case of like, oh, if our children are taught by someone wearing a hijab, or wearing some other religious clothing, like, well, they're going to be like affected in some sort of undefined way. I mean, like, I think it's like it's an introducing kids to religious diversity and stuff, and it doesn't necessarily, like, if the teacher was pushing religion on them, then yes, that would be a problem. But I don't think it's a problem so long as they're just doing their job and so on.
Well,
I mean, yeah.
but I think the flip side of it is, and this may not be literally how they do it, is that if you are so tied to your religion where you need to wear that all the time, you're not fit for a public job, right? And it's okay to discriminate against people in that way. I mean, I don't mean this in a like public sense, right? Where you can't wear your religion on your sleeve, you can't get a tattoo, you can't be that person publicly. But the idea that you can be a public official and do that, that's not the right job for you, right? And this comes back to that sort of the paradox of tolerance, where if we're going to tolerate, if we're going to have a multicultural pluralistic society, we need to tolerate one another. And people who are not tolerant, we got to get rid of them, right? You can't allow, not sending them to the camps, but like you can't allow any sort of intolerance because it spreads. It ruins the whole thing for everyone. So that idea, and we've seen this in the US where we have, town hall officials not issuing marriage licenses for gay couples because of their religion. Well, you're not fucking fit to be a public official if that's what you're doing, right? That's part of your job. Or pharmacists who don't want to dispense drugs because of their religious beliefs. If you have these biases, you're intolerant of other people's needs, you're not capable of doing that job. You wouldn't hire, like, if we went to a church and we're like, hey, you should hire us as ministers,
Right.
right? I mean, the first thing they'd ask is like, well, do you believe in God? And we're like, no, like, you can't be a minister. They're able to discriminate. And I think there needs to be some way to discriminate.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree in that case where their religion prevents them from, like, carrying out their duties. I mean, in that case, yeah, definitely they should be. But I think in a case of I think the thing is, like, does wearing a hijab, for example, does that prevent you from teaching well to the kids, or being a police officer, or something like this? I mean, I don't really think it does. I mean, you could make some kind of argument, like, I mean, I think the argument is, like, the sort of any public facing officials representing the state should appear as neutral as possible. Um, but I mean, again, I mean, in some cases, it's not possible to be totally neutral because there's certain things that are, like, immutable about yourself. Like, um, you couldn't, you'll have a gender or something like that, or a race. I mean, yeah, you can't appear as just sort of a generic human being. So, so there's always going to be something. I mean, yeah, but anyway, I mean, I think the thing is, like, it's just something to debate about. Yeah.
Yeah, it's something that we've got to work out and be amenable to, right? And like we as atheists, there are things we don't know about religion and being religious. And we'd have to take all that under consideration. Yeah, I don't know how well people can be neutral about it, but I think we would both agree, like, yeah, if someone's proselytizing in the classroom, you got to fire them. If they like, you can't do that.
Hmm. Yeah, I think
But
that's sort of a
yeah,
easier case. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, and I think it's important to, like, again, just that as non-religious people become the plurality and then maybe a majority. I mean, how we deal with these issues, it's somewhat unprecedented, I think, really, where there is such a case. I mean, yeah, I think that, like the Soviet Union case. I mean, it was a case where non-religious people were kind of leading the country, but I don't think it was, like, probably the majority were still Christian in some sense.
no, yeah, and the minority leadership were the ones who were
Yes.
like, "What? We should be more atheist. We need
Yeah.
more
Right.
atheists,"
Exactly. Yeah.
and they're just not getting it.
Hmm. Hmm.
And that's a case where, like, when the interesting thing about the Soviet model is the one place they seemed extremely successful was the marriage ceremonies, which we think of as like that's not a state issue, right? That's a sociological, it's cultural, it's something that we recreate, not it's something that you get to decide how your wedding's going to be, but it's that's the thing that sort of survived.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
So
yeah, that
like
was interesting.
what
Yeah.
should the state's role be in cultural reproduction? But I mean that's not where Jacques looked, pointed. What's the state's role? How strict, how stringent, how cooperative should it be? All of this is something that we'll have to answer in due time.
Yeah, I think just one other quick point is like is the way sort of the state version of secularism kind of links with culture. I mean, like I think he did mention, about in France, like people maybe just don't like you talking too much about your religion. I mean, that has nothing to do with the state, but I think it's maybe more just a cultural thing. It's just something maybe you don't talk about that much in public, or yeah. I mean, I think it's interesting, and then like how laws can drive culture and vice versa. I mean, I think it's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and I think we ended on a good place too, where he pointed out, look, there are plenty of good reasons for religions to support a greater secularism, right? Keep that non-interference, maintain a distance from the state, not have the state subsidize competing religions. Whatever it is, there are lots of, even if um, atheism or non-religion does not become the majority, there are plenty of reasons why people should support secularism. And if you are a member of a religious organization and you, under George W. Bush or Obama or Trump, started getting money without regulation, it may not be the next 4 years, it may not be the next 10 or 12 years, but sooner or later, taking that money, that's an entryway for state regulation. And if religions do not want regulation, they should support greater secularization.
Hmm. I think, yeah, another just like they may wind up in the minority case, and they don't. I mean, that's the thing. I guess that's a good thing about secularism. It's sort of the like the veil of ignorance that John Rawls thing, where like you sort of make structure the society in a way that you don't know where you're going to end up, like if you're going to be privileged or not privileged or whatever, and you try and devise a system that would be best regardless, without knowing if you're going to be like a religious majority or minority. So yeah, I
Right.
think that's something about secularism. Yeah. Yeah.
Totally. Yeah, because these things are changing.
Hmm. Yeah.
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 And if you are one of those religious people or part of a religious organization who believes that secularism is code for atheism and it's the promotion of atheism and it's its own religion that's being imposed upon you, that's complete bullshit. And if you've got a problem with that, come at me. Come at me. You can tweet me, Nath G. Alexander at the Twitter. I'd love to hear from you.
Hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, do you have anything else coming up, Nathan? Any shout outs we got to make before we get out of here? This was a long one.
Yeah, it was. Yeah.
Rich.
Yeah.
Good.
Let's thank first our patrons Lars and Debbie, and
Paula. Yep.
more generally just everyone for listening. And
Absolutely.
yeah.
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 Big thanks to you guys. But we'll be
Anyway.
back with this later. So thanks everyone for listening. Like and subscribe. Smash those buttons. Pull the string. Kick the dog. Is that an option down there? No. Like and subscribe. Nath G. Alexander at Twitter. Look forward to hearing from you all and talk to you later.